There are moments in psychological development that mark genuine transformation, clear signs that you have moved through rather than around your deepest struggles, that you have integrated rather than simply suppressed what once controlled you, that you have become fundamentally different rather than merely performing recovery while remaining unchanged beneath the surface. Carl Jung spent his life studying these transformations, identifying the markers that distinguish genuine psychological growth from the mere appearance of it, recognizing the signs that someone has done the difficult work of individuation rather than simply constructing new defenses or better adapted personas. These signs are not dramatic or obvious from outside. You do not suddenly become perfect or transcendent or free from all struggle. The transformation is subtler, more internal, more about changed relationship to yourself and to your experience than about changed external circumstances or eliminated problems. The person who has overcome their deeper struggle still faces difficulties, still experiences pain, still encounters challenges, but something fundamental has shifted in how they relate to these experiences, in how they process emotion, in how they engage with their own psyche and with others. Understanding these signs matters because most people confuse symptom suppression with actual healing, mistake the ability to function with genuine transformation, believe they have overcome struggles they have actually only learned to avoid more skillfully. The person who appears successful, who maintains relationships, who achieves goals, may be simply performing recovery while the actual wound remains unhealed, the complex remains unintegrated, the shadow remains projected. But the person who has genuinely overcome their deepest struggle displays specific signs that Jung identified, markers that indicate real psychological work has occurred rather than merely surface adaptation. These are not signs you can fake or perform. They emerge naturally from genuine integration, from having faced what you spent years avoiding, from having brought unconscious material into consciousness and metabolized it rather than simply building better defenses against it. This is how you recognize that transformation has occurred. The first clear sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that you are no longer possessed by it. This does not mean the struggle disappears or that you never think about it or that triggers cease to exist. It means that when something activates the old wound, when circumstances echo the original trauma, when the pattern that once controlled you attempts to reassert itself, you can observe it without being taken over by it, can feel the pull without being dragged into the old response, can recognize what is happening without becoming it. Jung called this possession by complexes, the moments when an autonomous psychic pattern takes control of consciousness, when you are temporarily no longer yourself, but are the wounded child or the traumatized adolescent, or whatever version of yourself formed around the original struggle. Before integration, these possessions were complete, were total takeovers where you lost access to your adult rational capacities and simply reacted from the complex, from the old wound, from the unprocessed trauma. The person still caught in their deepest struggle is regularly possessed without recognizing it. Their partner does something that echoes an old abandonment, and they are suddenly the terrified child, clinging and accusing and unable to see present reality clearly. A colleague challenges them and they are suddenly the humiliated adolescent, defensive and aggressive in ways that have nothing to do with the actual situation. A setback occurs and they are suddenly the helpless victim, collapsing into despair that is disproportionate to circumstances because they are not responding to present setback, but to accumulated failures from the past. But the person who has overcome their deepest struggle experiences these activations differently. They feel the pull, recognize the familiar pattern trying to assert itself, notice the old wound being triggered. But there is space between the trigger and the response. There is observing consciousness that can witness what is happening without being completely identified with it. There is capacity to say internally, this is the old pattern, this is the complex being activated. This is not actually about present circumstances, but about past trauma being stirred. This observing capacity is not detachment or dissociation or emotional numbness. You still feel the emotion, still experience the activation, still notice the impulse toward the old response. But you are not completely taken over by it, are not possessed by it, are not reduced to only the wounded part that is being triggered. There is larger awareness that can hold the triggered response within broader context, that can recognize it as partial truth rather than as total reality, that can choose whether to act from the complex or whether to respond from a more integrated place. This capacity develops through years of doing the work Jung described, through bringing unconscious material into consciousness, through recognizing patterns and their origins, through understanding that extreme reactions signal complex activation rather than proportionate response to present reality. The person has learned to catch themselves, to notice when they are being pulled into possession, to create the pause that allows choice rather than automatic reaction. The practical result is that relationships improve dramatically because you are no longer projecting your unintegrated wounds onto partners, no longer reacting to them as if they are the original wounding figures, no longer making them responsible for healing traumas they did not cause. You can see them more clearly as they actually are, rather than through the distorting lens of your activated complexes. You can respond to what is actually happening rather than to what the complex interprets as happening based on past experience. Work situations become more manageable because criticism or setbacks no longer trigger complete collapse or defensive rage, but are met with capacity to assess whether the feedback is valid, whether the setback is significant, whether the response emerging is proportionate to circumstances or is complex being activated. You can distinguish between genuine threat and echoes of old threats, between actual failure and situations that feel like failure because they resonate with past wounds. The person who has overcome their deepest struggle still has moments of activation, still feels the old wounds being stirred, still experiences emotional intensity when triggers occur, but they are no longer helplessly possessed, no longer completely taken over, no longer reduced to only the wounded part. There is observing consciousness, there is capacity for choice, there is space between trigger and response, where integration allows different outcomes than the old patterns would have produced. This is the first and most fundamental sign. You are no longer possessed by your struggle. You can be triggered without being taken over, can feel the old wound without becoming only the wound, can recognize the pattern without being controlled by it. This does not happen through willpower or through suppression, but happens through genuine integration, through having brought the unconscious complex into relationship with consciousness where it can be witnessed rather than simply acted out. The second clear sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that you have withdrawn your projections, that you no longer need external enemies to carry the aspects of yourself you cannot acknowledge, that the people who once triggered intense reactions now appear as ordinary humans rather than as embodiments of everything wrong with the world. Jung understood that projection is the primary mechanism through which we avoid facing our own shadow, through which we externalize what we cannot accept internally, through which we see in others the qualities we most thoroughly deny in ourselves. Before integration, before you have faced your deepest struggle, the world is full of enemies who carry your projections. These are the people who embody everything you despise, everything you judge harshly, everything that triggers reactions so intense that they seem completely justified by the other person's behavior. The cruel person you cannot tolerate carries your denied cruelty. The weak person you despise carries your rejected vulnerability. The arrogant person who enrages you carries the superiority you cannot acknowledge in yourself. The hypocrite you judge carries the contradictions you refuse to see in your own behavior. These projections feel completely real, feel like accurate perceptions of the other person's actual qualities rather than like your own denied aspects being seen in them. You are convinced that you are simply observing objective reality, that the other person genuinely possesses these terrible qualities, that your intense reaction is proportionate and justified. The possibility that you are seeing yourself, that the qualities that disturb you most reveal what you have most thoroughly rejected in yourself. This possibility never enters awareness because the projection operates automatically beneath consciousness as fundamental defense against self-knowledge. But the person who has overcome their deepest struggle experiences a dramatic shift in how they perceive others. The enemies begin to appear as ordinary people with flaws and struggles, as complex humans, rather than as embodiments of evil or weakness, or whatever quality was being projected. The intense judgments soften, the harsh reactions diminish. The certainty that the other person is terrible or wrong or disgusting begins to dissolve. This is not because you have become naive, or have lost capacity for discrimination, or have decided to see everything as equally acceptable. This is because you have integrated the shadow qualities you were projecting, have acknowledged in yourself the cruelty or weakness or arrogance or hypocrisy that you were seeing in others. This withdrawal of projections creates profound change in relationships. People you could not be around without intense negative reaction become tolerable, even interesting in their complexity. Conflicts that seem to be about the other person's intolerable behavior are revealed to have been about your own unintegrated material being activated by certain triggers. You can see others more clearly as they actually are, rather than as carriers of your denied aspects, can respond to their actual behavior rather than to what the projection interpreted their behavior to mean. The withdrawal also changes political and cultural engagement. Before integration, you needed ideological enemies, needed groups or movements or public figures to embody everything wrong, everything threatening, everything that must be opposed. Your political identity was organized around who you were against, what you were fighting, which groups carried the qualities you most thoroughly rejected. But after integration, after facing your own shadow, the enemies become less necessary, the stark divisions become less clear. The certainty that the other side is purely wrong while your side is purely right begins to dissolve. This does not mean you lose your values or stop having political positions or see all perspectives as equally valid. It means you can hold your positions without needing to demonize those who disagree, can oppose certain policies without needing to see those who support them as evil or stupid or morally inferior. They can recognize that the qualities you oppose in the other side often exist in your own side and in yourself. The political engagement becomes less about psychological projection and more about actual policy disagreements, less about needing enemies to carry your shadow and more about genuine differences in values and priorities. The person who has overcome their deepest struggle still has preferences, still disagrees with others, still finds certain behaviors unacceptable. But the quality of the disagreement changes, becomes less emotionally charged, less personally threatening, less about the other person embodying everything wrong. You can disagree without despising, can oppose without needing to destroy, can recognize flaws without needing to condemn the entire person. This shift indicates that you have withdrawn projections, that you have owned what you were placing onto others, that you have integrated the shadow qualities you were externalizing. The third clear sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that you can hold paradox, can contain contradictions without needing to resolve them prematurely, can be multiple things simultaneously without experiencing this multiplicity as fragmentation or inconsistency that must be eliminated. Jung understood that psychological maturity requires developing what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension between opposites without collapsing into either pole, without requiring that one side win and the other be eliminated, without seeking false unity through suppression of whatever does not fit the preferred self-image. Before integration, before facing your deepest struggle, you likely experience yourself in binary terms, as either good or bad, either strong or weak, either competent or incompetent, either worthy or worthless. The struggle itself often centered on this binary, on the terror of being the negative pole, on the desperate need to maintain identification with the positive pole, on the collapse that occurred when circumstances forced recognition that you contained the qualities you had identified as purely negative and tried to eliminate from your self-concept. This binary thinking creates constant internal warfare because humans are not simple, are not purely one thing, contain contradictions and multiplicities that cannot be forced into neat categories without doing violence to reality. You are sometimes cruel and sometimes kind. You are sometimes strong and sometimes weak. You are sometimes competent and sometimes incompetent. You contain masculine and feminine qualities. You possess both light and darkness. You are capable of both noble self-sacrifice and petty selfishness, trying to be only one pole, trying to eliminate the other, trying to maintain consistent identity that excludes contradiction. This creates the struggle, creates the internal division, creates the war against aspects of yourself that will not be eliminated. The person still caught in their deepest struggle cannot tolerate these contradictions, experiences them as threatening, as evidence of failure or hypocrisy or fundamental brokenness. They need to be consistently one thing, need to resolve the paradox by eliminating one pole, need to maintain rigid identity even when this rigidity prevents genuine living. They cannot be both confident and uncertain, must be either one or the other. They cannot contain both anger and love toward the same person. They must decide the person is either good or bad. They cannot be both succeeding and failing, must interpret every experience as evidence for one category or the other. But the person who has overcome their deepest struggle has developed capacity to hold these contradictions, to be paradox without experiencing this as inconsistency that must be resolved. They can be confident in some areas while uncertain in others, without this meaning they are completely incompetent. They can feel both love and anger toward the same person without needing to decide the person is purely good or purely bad. They can succeed in some ways while failing in others without this meaning their entire identity is either success or failure. This holding of paradox extends to self-concept. You can acknowledge your cruelty without this meaning you are purely cruel person. You can recognize your weakness without this meaning you are purely weak. You can see your failures without this, meaning you are purely failure. You can own your shadow qualities, the aspects you once had to deny completely, without these qualities defining your entire identity or eliminating the positive qualities you also possess. You are both. You contain multitudes. You are contradiction that does not need to be resolved into false unity. The practical result is dramatic reduction in internal conflict and in defensive rigidity. You no longer need to maintain impossible standards of consistency, no longer experience every failure or every display of denied qualities as catastrophic threat to identity. No longer waste enormous energy defending against acknowledgement of aspects that contradict your preferred self-image. You can be wrong without being completely wrong. You can fail without being complete failure. You can display qualities you once condemned without this, meaning you are a terrible person who must be rejected or eliminated. This capacity also transforms relationships because you can hold contradictions about others, can recognize that people are complex rather than simple, can maintain connection even when the person displays qualities you dislike, can disagree profoundly while still seeing the person's humanity and validity. You do not need others to be purely good or purely bad. You do not need to idealize or demonize, can hold the tension of complex reality, where people are mixtures of admirable and flawed, where relationships contain both connection and conflict, where love coexists with frustration. The sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that paradox no longer threatens you. Contradictions no longer require immediate resolution. Multiplicity is experienced as richness rather than as fragmentation. You have developed the transcendent function, can hold the tension, can be both without needing to choose only one. The fourth clear sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that your relationship to suffering has fundamentally transformed, that you no longer need pain to mean something or serve some purpose in order to bear it, that you can face difficulty directly without the defensive narratives that once made suffering tolerable only by making it meaningful or redemptive or part of some larger plan. Jung recognized that much of what we call meaning-making is actually defense against the unbearable recognition that suffering is often random, purposeless, not deserved or earned, or arranged by benevolent universe to teach us lessons we need to learn. Before integration, before facing your deepest struggle, you likely needed suffering to make sense. needed trauma to have been for something. You needed pain to serve higher purpose, even if that purpose was only your own growth or strengthening or development of character. The struggle had to mean something, because if it did not, if it was simply pain that happened for no reason and taught no lesson and served no purpose, then it was unbearable, was meaningless horror that consciousness could not accept without constructing defensive narratives to make it tolerable. These narratives take predictable forms. Everything happens for a reason. The universe never gives you more than you can handle. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Suffering builds character. Trauma makes you more empathetic or resilient or appreciative of what you have. The struggle was necessary preparation for future challenges. These are not deliberate lies, but are genuine psychological defenses, are ways consciousness protects itself from confronting that suffering is often arbitrary, that the universe is indifferent, that pain does not necessarily serve any purpose beyond being pain. The person still caught in their deepest struggle clings to these narratives desperately, because without them, the suffering seems unbearable, seems like pure loss with no compensation, seems like damage that cannot be integrated into coherent life story where everything serves some purpose. They need to believe their trauma made them stronger, their pain taught them important lessons, their struggle prepared them for something, because the alternative, that they simply suffered for no reason and lost years or decades to pain that served no purpose, this is too devastating to accept. But the person who has overcome their deepest struggle has moved beyond this need for meaning, has faced the possibility that suffering might not mean anything, might not serve higher purpose, might simply be pain that happened and did damage and taught no lessons and served no divine plan. This is not nihilism or despair, but is acceptance, is capacity to face reality without defensive narratives, is recognition that life contains suffering that does not need to be justified or explained or made meaningful in order to be born. This does not mean you conclude suffering is always meaningless, or that pain never teaches anything, or that trauma cannot lead to growth. It means you no longer need these outcomes in order to accept what happened, no longer require suffering to have been worthwhile or necessary or part of some plan. You can acknowledge that what happened hurt you and damaged you and cost you years without needing to add redemptive narrative that makes the pain acceptable by making it meaningful. The practical difference is profound. You can acknowledge trauma without needing to claim it made you stronger, can recognize losses without needing to find silver linings, can face damage without defensive stories about how it was necessary or served higher purpose. You can say it hurt, it damaged me, I lost time and opportunities and parts of myself, and this is simply true without needing to be justified or reframed or made acceptable through narratives about lessons learned or character built. This acceptance also means you no longer unconsciously seek suffering as a way to prove your strength, or to earn meaning, or to fulfill narrative about struggle being necessary for growth. The person still caught in deeper struggle often recreates painful patterns, partly because the patterns are familiar, but partly because suffering has become how they prove their worth, how they demonstrate their resilience, how they earn meaning through enduring pain. They unconsciously need the struggle because they have built identity around being someone who overcomes, someone who is strengthened by adversity, someone whose suffering serves purpose. But the person who has overcome their deepest struggle no longer needs this, no longer seeks suffering as proof of strength or source of meaning. It can choose easier paths without this meaning. They are avoiding growth or taking the coward's way. They have learned that suffering is sometimes unavoidable but is never necessary, that growth can occur through joy as well as through pain, that the narrative about struggle being essential to development is itself defense against accepting that much suffering serves no purpose beyond being suffering. The fifth clear sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that your relationships have transformed from need-based transactions into genuine meetings between whole people, that you no longer require others to complete you or heal you or carry parts of yourself you cannot own, that intimacy no longer terrifies you because you are no longer desperately hiding the authentic self while performing an acceptable version for others to love. Jung understood that unintegrated wounds create relationships based on unconscious needs and projections rather than on genuine encounter, that people use relationships to avoid facing themselves rather than as contexts for mutual recognition and growth. Before integration, before facing your deepest struggle, your relationships likely served functions that had little to do with genuine connection and everything to do with unconscious needs you could not acknowledge or meet directly. You needed partners to validate your worth because you could not validate yourself. You needed friends to confirm your identity because you had no stable sense of who you were beneath the performances. You needed others to carry qualities you had rejected in yourself, to be the strong one or the emotional one or the responsible one, so you could remain in the complementary role that felt safe, even if limiting. These need-based relationships created specific patterns that seemed like intimacy but were actually mutual avoidance, were two people using each other to avoid facing themselves, were connections based on what each person could provide, rather than on genuine appreciation of who they actually are. You chose partners who would replay familiar dynamics, who would trigger your wounds in ways that felt like home, even when home was painful, who would allow you to remain in the role you knew how to play rather than challenging you to grow beyond it. The relationships also required extensive performance, required hiding authentic self because authentic self seemed unlovable, required maintaining carefully curated version that would be acceptable while the real person remained hidden and unknown, and fundamentally alone even within intimate partnership. You could not risk being genuinely seen because being seen meant being rejected, meant discovering that who you actually are beneath the performance is not enough, is not worthy of love, is the shameful reality you have spent your life trying to escape or transform or hide. But the person who has overcome their deepest struggle relates differently, has moved from need-based transaction to genuine meeting, has developed capacity for what Martin Buber called I-thou relationship, where each person recognizes and honors the full humanity of the other rather than using them to meet unconscious needs or to avoid facing themselves. You no longer need partners to complete you because you have developed relationship with your own wholeness. You no longer need them to validate you because you can validate yourself, no longer need them to carry rejected aspects because you have integrated these aspects. This transformation means you can be genuinely yourself in relationship, can show the authentic person beneath the performances. You can risk being seen because you have already seen yourself and have learned that who you actually are is acceptable, even with all the flaws and limitations and shadow qualities that you once believed made you unlovable. The terror of intimacy diminishes because intimacy no longer means risking catastrophic rejection of your core self, no longer means exposing the shameful reality you have spent your life hiding. The relationships become reciprocal rather than complementary, become two whole people meeting rather than two partial people using each other to create false wholeness, become genuine encounter rather than mutual avoidance. You can appreciate your partner for who they actually are, rather than for how well they meet your unconscious needs or how effectively they allow you to avoid facing yourself. You can see them clearly rather than through projection, can respond to their actual behavior rather than to what your wounds interpret their behavior to mean. This also means you can tolerate conflict and difference without experiencing these as threats to the relationship or as evidence that the connection is failing. Before integration, conflict triggered terror because it meant the other person might leave, might reject you, might discover that you are not who you pretended to be, and decide you are unworthy. But after integration, conflict is simply disagreement between two different people, is natural consequence of genuine relationship between authentic individuals, is opportunity for understanding rather than catastrophe to be avoided. The person who has overcome their deepest struggle can also be alone without this meaning they are lonely, can enjoy solitude without experiencing it as evidence of being unlovable or rejected, can choose time apart from relationship without this threatening the connection. The capacity for genuine solitude and the capacity for genuine intimacy develop together, because both require having relationship with your own wholeness, rather than needing others to complete you, or validate you, or carry parts of yourself. You cannot own. The sixth clear sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that your dreams have changed quality, that the unconscious is no longer sending desperate warning signals or replaying trauma or presenting nightmares that terrorize, but is instead offering guidance and imagery that feels collaborative rather than adversarial, that your relationship with the unconscious has shifted from warfare to negotiation, from being attacked or overwhelmed to being informed and supported. Jung understood dreams as the primary communication channel from the unconscious, as the way the larger self attempts to guide and correct and balance the limited perspective of ego consciousness. Before integration, before facing your deepest struggle, your dreams likely had particular quality that reflected the internal conflict, the unintegrated material, the complexes operating autonomously beneath awareness. You had recurring nightmares that replayed traumatic experiences or presented scenarios where you were helpless or threatened or failing in ways that echoed your deepest fears. You had anxiety dreams where you were unprepared for exams or naked in public or unable to escape danger. You had dreams where you were pursued or attacked or humiliated or abandoned. These dreams were not random mental noise, but were the unconscious attempting to bring attention to unintegrated material, to complexes that needed integration, to shadow aspects that were being denied, to imbalances that consciousness was creating through rigid identification with partial identity. The nightmares were emergency signals, were the unconscious using the only language available to get consciousness to pay attention to what was being avoided, to force recognition of what could not be acknowledged directly. The person still caught in their deepest struggle often cannot remember dreams or dismisses them as meaningless, as random brain activity with no significance, as disturbances to be eliminated through better sleep hygiene or medication. This dismissal is its self-defense, is consciousness refusing the messages from unconscious, because receiving them would require facing what has been avoided, would require acknowledging that the ego is not in control, and that something larger is attempting to communicate truths that consciousness does not want to hear. But the person who has overcome their deeper struggle experiences dramatic shift in dream quality and in their relationship to dreams. The nightmares diminish or cease entirely, not through suppression but through integration of what the nightmares were trying to bring to awareness. The anxiety dreams become less frequent because the anxieties have been faced and processed rather than continuing to accumulate in the unconscious. The dreams of being pursued or attacked transform because the shadow aspects represented by the pursuers have been integrated rather than continuing to be projected and denied. What emerges instead are dreams that feel helpful, that offer guidance or perspective or imagery that enriches understanding, that present problems in symbolic form that consciousness can work with, that introduce aspects of self or life that have not yet been fully recognized or developed. The unconscious becomes ally rather than adversary, becomes source of wisdom and creativity rather than source of terror and disturbance, becomes collaborative partner in the individuation process rather than enemy that must be suppressed or ignored. The practical difference is profound. You begin to attend to dreams, to record them, to reflect on their imagery and symbolism, to recognize them as valuable communications rather than as meaningless disturbances. You notice when dreams are pointing towards something you have been avoiding, when they are offering perspective you had not considered, when they are introducing aspects of yourself or your situation that consciousness has not yet integrated. You develop what Jung called active imagination, the capacity to engage consciously with unconscious imagery, to dialogue with dream figures, to allow the unconscious material to inform and enrich conscious understanding. This changed relationship to dreams also indicates changed relationship to the unconscious in general. You are no longer fighting against it, no longer trying to maintain conscious control over everything, no longer experiencing unconscious material as purely threatening or disturbing. You have learned that consciousness is limited, that the ego's perspective is partial, that the larger self, represented by the unconscious, has access to wisdom and perspective that consciousness alone cannot achieve. You become more receptive to intuition, to the subtle signals that emerge from unconscious processing, to the knowing that arises without conscious reasoning, to the creative insights that appear when you stop trying to force solutions through willpower and rational analysis alone. You trust the process, trust that the psyche is moving toward wholeness even when consciousness cannot see the path. Trust that the unconscious is working on your behalf rather than against you. The sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that your dreams have changed from warning signals and nightmares to collaborative communications, that the unconscious feels like ally rather than enemy, that you have developed relationship with the larger self that informs and enriches rather than threatens and disturbs. The seventh and final clear sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that you have developed what Jung called the religious attitude, not necessarily belief in God or adherence to organized religion, but a sense of connection to something larger than your individual ego, a recognition that your life participates in patterns and meanings that transcend personal concerns, a capacity to serve purposes beyond your own comfort or success or survival. This is the deepest transformation, is movement from ego-centered existence to self-centered existence, is shift from asking what the world can do for you to asking what you can offer, what you are called to serve, what meaning your life might embody beyond personal gratification. Before integration, before facing your deepest struggle, your life was likely organized around ego concerns, around getting your needs met, around achieving success or security or recognition, around protecting yourself from pain or rejection or failure. Even your relationships and your work and your choices were filtered through the question of how they served you, whether they made you happy or fulfilled or secure, whether they met your needs or threatened them. This is not selfishness, but is natural state of unintegrated ego, is how consciousness operates when it believes itself to be the center, when it has not yet recognized that it is part of larger whole that has its own purposes and patterns. The deepest struggle itself was usually ego-centered, was about your pain, your trauma, your needs not being met, your worth not being recognized, your desires being frustrated, your identity being threatened. The struggle consumed enormous energy because everything was filtered through whether it served or threatened the ego, whether it made you feel better or worse, whether it confirmed or challenged your self-concept. You were trapped in what Jung called ego inflation when successful or ego deflation when failing, but both states were equally ego-centered, both organized around your personal concerns rather than around larger patterns or purposes. But the person who has overcome their deepest struggle has undergone what Jung called ego death and rebirth, has experienced the dissolution of ego as center and its reformation as servant of the self, has moved from ego-centered to self-centered existence. This does not mean eliminating ego or transcending it in some mystical sense, but means right-sizing it, means recognizing that ego is important but is not sovereign, is necessary but is not the whole story, serves crucial functions but is not the meaning or purpose of existence. This transformation manifests as sense of vocation, of being called to something, of having purposes that transcend personal gratification. You recognize that your life is not just about you, that your experiences, including your suffering, might serve larger patterns, that you have gifts or insights or capacities that can serve others or contribute to collective purposes beyond your individual concerns. This is not grandiosity, but is genuine recognition of how your particular life participates in larger wholes, how your unique combination of experiences and capacities might serve purposes you could not have chosen, but can recognize and commit to once they emerge. The religious attitude also appears as capacity for genuine gratitude, not the forced positivity that denies pain, but the recognition that existence itself is gift, that being here at all is improbable and precious, that your life with all its suffering and struggle is still participation in something larger and more meaningful than personal comfort or success. You can be grateful for life without this, meaning you are grateful for trauma. You can appreciate existence without needing everything to have been perfect. We can recognize value in simply being here and being conscious and being capable of participating in the ongoing creation of meaning. This does not mean you become passive or accept everything without resistance or stop working to improve conditions or relieve suffering. It means your activism comes from a different place, comes from sense of service rather than from ego need, comes from recognition of what life requires rather than from what you personally want, comes from commitment to purposes that transcend your individual concerns, even while including them. The person who has overcome their deepest struggle often finds that the struggle itself, once integrated, becomes source of their capacity to serve, that the pain they processed gives them insight into others' pain, that the patterns they recognized in themselves help them recognize similar patterns in the collective, that their hard-won wisdom becomes gift they can offer rather than private achievement they must protect. The suffering that once seemed meaningless reveals itself to have been preparation, not because it was arranged by a benevolent universe, but because integration transformed it from pure loss into resource that can serve larger purposes. The sign that you have overcome your deepest struggle is that you have moved beyond ego-centered existence into life organized around service to the self, around participation in larger patterns, around purposes that transcend personal concerns while including them, around what Jung called individuation in service of the collective rather than individuation as purely personal achievement. Conclusion: these 7 signs mark genuine transformation, indicate that you have moved through rather than around your deepest struggle, that you have integrated rather than merely suppressed what once controlled you, that you have become fundamentally different rather than simply performing recovery while remaining unchanged beneath the surface. The signs are not dramatic or obvious from outside, but represent profound internal shifts that Jung identified as marking real psychological growth rather than mere adaptation or symptom management. You are no longer possessed by your struggle, can observe it being triggered without being taken over by it, can feel the pull of old patterns without being dragged into automatic responses. You have withdrawn your projections, no longer need external enemies to carry aspects of yourself you cannot acknowledge. You can see others as complex humans, rather than as embodiments of qualities you deny in yourself. You can hold paradox, contain contradictions without needing to resolve them prematurely, can be multiple things simultaneously without experiencing this as fragmentation that must be eliminated. Your relationship to suffering has transformed. You no longer need pain to mean something or serve higher purpose in order to bear it, can face difficulty directly without defensive narratives that make suffering tolerable only by making it redemptive. Your relationships have moved from need-based transactions to genuine meetings. You no longer require others to complete you or heal you or carry parts of yourself you cannot own. Your dreams have changed quality. The unconscious sense guidance rather than warnings, has become ally rather than adversary in your development. And you have developed the religious attitude, have moved from ego-centered existence to life organized around service to the self, around purposes that transcend personal concerns, around recognition that your life participates in patterns and meanings larger than individual gratification or success or survival. These signs cannot be faked or performed. They emerge naturally from genuine integration, from having faced what you spent years avoiding, from having brought unconscious material into consciousness and metabolized it rather than simply building better defenses against it. They indicate that you have done the work Jung described, have undertaken the individuation process, have moved toward wholeness rather than remaining fragmented and at war with yourself. Most people never develop these signs, never overcome their deepest struggles, remain caught in patterns they cannot break because they cannot see the unconscious forces creating the patterns. They manage symptoms, adapt better, function more successfully, but the fundamental wound remains unhealed. The complex remains unintegrated. The shadow remains projected. The struggle continues beneath improved surface. But some do the work, face what must be faced, integrate what must be integrated, transform, rather than simply adapt. For these people, the signs emerge naturally, mark the genuine transformation that Jung believed was possible for those willing to undertake the difficult journey toward wholeness. The signs indicate not that you have become perfect or transcendent or free from all struggle, but that you have changed your relationship to struggle, have integrated rather than remained fragmented, have moved toward the wholeness that Jung called the self. Understanding these signs matters because they provide markers that distinguish genuine transformation from mere adaptation, provide recognition that the difficult work of facing your deepest struggle has yielded real change rather than simply better performance of mental health. They confirm that integration is possible, that transformation is real, that the individuation process Jung described is not abstract theory but is actual psychological development that can be recognized through specific signs when it occurs. The question is whether you will recognize these signs in yourself, whether you have done the work that produces them, whether you have faced your deepest struggle or have simply learned to avoid it more skillfully. The signs are clear, are specific, are the markers Jung identified as indicating genuine psychological growth. They emerge from integration, from bringing unconscious material into consciousness, from facing what you spend years avoiding, from becoming whole rather than remaining fragmented. If these signs are present, you have overcome your deepest struggle. If they are absent, the work remains. The choice is whether you will continue avoiding, continue performing recovery while remaining unchanged, or whether you will face what must be faced, integrate what must be integrated, undertake the difficult journey that Jung described as the fundamental task of human development.